We are in Esther chapter 1. Esther chapter 1. Now, last week, when we looked at Esther, we looked at some of these critical issues, kind of tried to give the context to what's going on here. We're in the Persian period. Xerxes the first is the king, but in your Bible, he'll be referred to as Ahasuerus, which is the Hebrew term for Xerxes. We talked about how the book of Esther, in my opinion, plays out like a chess game, where you have the different pieces, small and large, moving by the hand of God. But what's interesting is that God's name is never mentioned in the entire book. But we sing a song sometimes in our vacation Bible school about the great big hippopotamus. And there's a line in that song that says God's fingerprints are everywhere. And I think that when you look at the book of Esther, God's fingerprints are truly everywhere. Because Esther is a narrative story and reads very much like a play, the book we're going to move very quickly through the book. We're going to have to read a lot before we can go back and talk about it. I hope that the way we've divided it up will be easy for you to follow. I hope that you have your Bibles where you can see it in maybe a bigger context than just what I have on the screen. Last week, I asked you to go home. I gave you a little bit of homework. I asked you to go home and read the book of Esther, but read it through twice. Now, I'm not sure if anybody in here did that. That's totally fine. That's up to you. You'll be graded on it later. But if you go through and you read through it, not just once, but twice and maybe a few times, I think you will pick up on some things that you hadn't noticed before. And so that's what we're looking for here, especially with a narrative. Many times when we read narrative, we read over and we skim over these things because we're so familiar with the story that we remove those details. So that's what we want to do tonight. We're going to begin in chapter 1, beginning in verse 1 and going through verse 4 here, as you see on the screen. We talked about this last week, but it's been 7 days between now and then, and so I think it best to just start at the beginning. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus, sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So the first 4 verses basically set the stage for what's going to happen in chapter 1 and I guess within the first part of chapter 2. We learn a lot about King Ahasuerus from verse 1 and 2. He is a very powerful man. He is the most powerful man in the known world. We need to remember that, especially when we get to Esther and along around chapter 4, where Esther goes and she begins to make plans to approach the king with this idea. We need to remember this is the most powerful man. If he says something, it happens. And what we're going to find about the law of the Medes and the Persians is that they cannot be changed. Once it is written into law, it cannot be revoked. And we're going to see that here within the next few passages. So he's sitting on his royal throne in Susa. Susa is going to be a big city. When we talk about the book of Esther, that's where the capital is. That's where all these things are going to take place. When Esther calls the fast, she's going to call for it for all the Jews who are in Susa. And so, which tells us that Susa is composed of a lot of different ethnic groups who speak a lot of different languages and who have a lot of different religious practices. So he's talking here in verse 3, the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officials and servants. Now, when you read on to chapter 1 and verse 5 and verse 6, and even following on further into chapter 1, we get a little bit of confusion as to what these 180 days are composed of. Is it 180 days of feasting? Is it 180 days of just gathering and then 7 days of feasting that we're going to see a little bit later? What's going on here with these 180 days? Well, you have to know a little bit about Xerxes' father. Xerxes' father was King Darius. Darius had one mission in mind his entire time that he was in office. He wanted to conquer Greece. Now, Darius was never able to conquer Greece. And so when Darius died and Xerxes comes to power, he wants to take his father's dream and make that a reality. Now, there is a historian named Herodotus who tells us quite a bit about the Persian Wars. And thank goodness that we have Herodotus, because Esther makes a whole lot more sense when you read it alongside Herodotus. Herodotus says that Xerxes I wanted to conquer Greece and that he met with these officials for 180 days to discuss a war strategy. Now, spoiler alert, Xerxes is going to go and try to conquer Greece, and he's going to get his tail whipped. Greece is going to put him in his place, and he's going to come back and he's going to be miserable, and we're going to see that evident in the text. So that's what's going on here for the 180 days. The book of Esther is so interesting because it provides us with literary structures that you really don't see many other places. And when you do see them, we need to take notice. The literary bookends of Esther is that it begins with a pagan feast and ends in chapter 10 with the Feast of Purim. You begin with a feast, you end with a feast. Feast for different reasons, but a feast nonetheless. Let me make sure I said everything I want to say about this. Okay. Verse 5 and 6. When these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains, violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rods, marble pillars, also couches of gold, silver on mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, precious stones. Okay, verse 6 is very important, though it doesn't sound like it. Verse 6 shows us all the riches and all the splendors of King Ahasuerus. Now, why does the book of Esther start out that way? Well, remember what we said last week about the author of the book of Esther, who we really don't know who it is. We can give theories all day long. The fact of the matter is the book itself never tells us. But what we know is that this has to be an eyewitness to the Persian court. So why are passages like verse 6, and there are some other passages in chapter 1 that talk about the splendor of the king, why are those so important? Because without them, we don't know the historical accuracy of Esther. But because we have them, we know that this is an eyewitness that's really there, who's really seeing these things. And again, to bring up our friend Herodotus, Herodotus says that King Xerxes I, who is Ahasuerus, same person, that he was the richest man to ever live. You can read Herodotus chapter 7 and verse 27 talks about Xerxes being the wealthiest man in the world. And so here you have a passage that shows the historical accuracy of the book of Esther. As a Bible scholar, that's very important to me, because I read articles and journal articles and books and commentaries all day long about how the Bible is not inspired, about how it's just a book that's been thrown together, and that fools like us believe it. Now, I don't believe that the Bible needs to prove anything to us, but I'm glad it does. Okay, so let's go back to verse 5. Sorry, I started in verse 6. When those days were completed, well, what days? The 180 days from verse 4. So when the 180 days were completed, when they've come together, all these high officials have made their military strategy, they've made their alliances, they know what they're going to do. After these days have been completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa a feast lasting for 7 days. So the 7 days after the 180 days, there's your feast. We learned something about the character of Ahasuerus here. He's kind of a think before you act, or an act before you think, I should say, kind of person. Right? Because what is the plan? According to Herodotus, the plan is to find a way to conquer Greece. But he hasn't done anything. All he's done is gathered the plan, and he's got all these officials. He hasn't gone out and done anything, but he's throwing this 7-day feast like he's already conquered the world. What we're going to find with Ahasuerus, remember, we're likening this to a chess game. And I said last week that Ahasuerus is the king. When you see him, he really doesn't do a whole lot, but you need to take notice of him. You need to always be aware of where the king is, right? In a game of chess, that's the rule. Same is true in the book of Esther. So he's kind of jumping the gun here. A lot of times we read the book of Esther and we look at Haman and we say, oh, Haman has a pride problem. Well, yes, he does. And that's going to be very evident as we continue to read. But Haman is not the only one. Ahasuerus has a pride problem. And it is the result of Ahasuerus' pride problem that puts Esther where she needs to be. Okay, so I had something else highlighted up here. Yeah, the 7 days. Okay, very good. Moving on, verse 7 through 9 here. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to the edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Okay, we're still in the context of the 7-day feast. What goes on at a 7-day feast? A lot of drinking. The Persians, the Medes and the Persians were known for their drinking bouts. If you were to read this book in the context of the Medes and the Persians, let's say we lived in that time, you wouldn't think twice about this. I mean, the Medes and the Persians, especially the officials, the government officials, they were drunk 24/7. Okay? Now, notice what it says, the drinks were served in golden vessels. Again, I'm glad it says that because our friend Herodotus tells us that the king only drank from golden vessels. Okay? There's historical accuracy. Royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. Now, remember, the king is in a context of all of his officials and all of the officials from the surrounding and neighboring areas. You want to throw a good party, right? So he wants to show off the things that he has, the power that he has, the wealth that he has. Now, notice verse 8. Verse 8 is a very interesting verse. Drinking was according to this edict, there is no compulsion. How many of your Bibles, if you have them open, say according to the law? Anybody's? I figured several of you would. This is obviously not the law of Moses that we're talking about here. Now, I know it's very easy for us to look at Scripture in a Jewish context and to think anytime it says law, we're talking about the law of Moses. Well, that's certainly not the case. It's kind of like in Exodus chapter 4 where God tells Moses that you will be as God to Aaron. Well, the word Elohim does not always mean God in the sense that we think of deity. It means a spiritual superior. And so we need to remember the context that we're reading in. Here we're talking about a law that is a law of the Medes and Persians about there being no compulsion. That's very important because the law of the Medes and Persians said that when the king took a drink, everyone took a drink. Now here's where the flexibility comes in with this particular passage. The law states, remember, the law can't be changed. And so if it's law, you have to do it. But by saying that there's no compulsion, every time that the king drank, you could drink as much as you wanted. You could let the liquid touch your lips. You could take a gulp, whatever. It was up to you, but you had to still drink when the king drank. This is a feast that's going on for 7 days. We should not think twice whenever we find out that the king got drunk and got mad. All right, remember, these are real people. And real people act just as regular people would. Verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. These men, they came, these officials, they came with their wives and with their families. The king is putting on a banquet for the men, a feast for the men. The queen is putting on a feast for the women. So, the two are not together. Right? Everybody with me? The two are not together. That's important because the king is going to call Vashti to come to him. Right? By the way, names in Hebrew are very, very important. Every Hebrew name can also be a verb. So, for example, which, by the way, when you read your Bible and you say they named him, so-and-so and so-and-so because insert situation here, their name literally means whatever the situation is. For example, Moses was named Moses because you drew him out of the water, okay? His name literally means to draw out of water, right? So, Vashti here, just to be completely honest, her name isn't Hebrew. We don't know what her name means. A lot of scholars think that her name means beautiful woman. And what a shallow name to have. I feel for this woman. Okay, verse 10. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, I would say so after 7 days, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagatha, Zethar, Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs, and at this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Now remember what I said about this being a true story with real people. Okay, it's very easy for us to read this just like we would watch a play or watch a movie. The good guys are always good, the bad guys are always bad. We don't need to think that when we're reading the Bible. People are people. That being said, we can look at this and we can see some things about Ahasuerus that are going to be very important, I believe, playing out in the rest of the book as you think about his character. So 7 days, dude's drunker than a skunk, bless his heart. He has 7 eunuchs. These 7 eunuchs come from 7 families, 7 royal families who were there, their sole purpose was to serve the king. The king's harem of wives, which, by the way, King Ahasuerus did not have just one wife. He had many wives, just like every other king in this time. What made Vashti so important? In the context of the Medes and Persians, one woman was given the title queen. Everyone else could be a wife of the king, sure, but only one person was given the title queen. In this context, it's Vashti. The queen was there to make the king look good. That was her only job. So, he calls for her to come in, and she refuses. Last week, I asked you, why do you think that Queen Vashti refused to come to King Ahasuerus? Anybody give that any thought? I don't think there's a wrong answer, by the way. The crickets aren't even talking. Yeah, for those who may not have heard Keith, he said she probably wouldn't have wanted to be put on display. Now, commentators have a number of theories. Like I said, I don't know that one is right and one is wrong. And by the way, I meant to say this last week, but if you're looking for a good commentary on the book of Esther, you're not going to find one. I have not found a good commentary on Esther. The closest thing I've come to finding good on the book of Esther is an Old Testament introduction book that covers Esther in about 10 pages or so. And the reason why is because it is a narrative and it's very difficult to commentate on narrative. And so commentators have very little to say about these things, but they all have their theories because they all have to sell books, right? So you come up with a theory so you can sell books. Not wanting to be put on display may very well be a good reason. The only problem I have with that theory is she's already been put on display by serving a banquet for the women. You know, she's a public figure. She's on display all the time. Now, the rabbis have something very interesting to say about this passage. And those of you who are in my ladies' Bible class on Wednesday mornings, you know I talk about the rabbis a lot because I think the rabbis are absolutely hilarious. They have a lot to say about things that they have absolutely no grounds to say. But the rabbis say that Vashti would have been completely naked except for her crown, and that the king wanted to show her physical beauty as she is completely naked, and she didn't want to do that because it's so degrading. Now, I don't want to take back what I said earlier about these rabbis really being out there on a lot of the things that they say. They really are. But I think they may be onto something here. They get that because the Hebrew tends to lead us to believe that when Ahasuerus says in verse 11, bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. The word with is a very flexible word in Hebrew. And it could very well be that he's saying bring her in her royal crown, implying only her royal crown. Now, again, we can't get that into the text. I definitely don't want to read into the text. I just want to make you aware of what some people may be saying about this. The fact of the matter is, she didn't want to come. Whatever reason that was, we don't know. I can't speak as a woman, but I would say if there's a group of, several hundred possibly drunk men, I wouldn't want to be there either. Okay? So I can't blame her for this. So she refused to come, and notice the end of verse 12. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. We need to remember something very important about Ahasuerus right now. Dude's drunk. All right? I don't know if y'all have ever had to deal with drunk people before. Drunk people don't make the best decisions. Drunk people let their emotions fly off the handle. Drunk people say things they don't mean. And I think what we're going to find as we continue reading chapter 1 is that Ahasuerus, in his drunken stage, is going to make this law that cannot be revoked, and he's going to regret it. He's going to realize that it's something he probably shouldn't have done. I want to say one more thing here about these 7 eunuchs. We talked about their families, but these 7 eunuchs were of a religious sect called Zoroastrians. You probably haven't heard of Zoroastrians before. If you have, I'd be very surprised. The Zoroastrians are where we today, where our world today, I should say, gets the idea of astrology, what do you call it? Your zodiac signs and predicting the future from the stars and all of that stuff. That originated with the Zoroastrians. There's a lot of good evidence to suggest that the wise men who came from the east to visit Jesus as a child were Zoroastrians because they saw the star, and the star led them to Jesus. Now, what does all that mean for this? Your advisors, your royal advisors, are very important as a king. You basically do everything that they say. Whether you agree or not, they're your sounding board. They are going to have certain presuppositions, certain ideas that are going to be very pleasing to Ahasuerus. So notice verse 13 through 15 here. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in the law and judgment. The men next to him being, I'm not even going to try to read these names, y'all. You can read them. I know Hebrew. I don't know how to pronounce these names, for crying out loud. The 7 princes of Persia and Media. So we're talking again about these families who saw the king's face, sat first in the kingdom. according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Okay, we're talking again about the law of the Medes and Persians. How many times have you heard it said? I've said it probably 4 or 5 times in this class so far, and we've only had 2 sessions in Esther. Now, how many times have you heard it said, the law of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed? Many times, I'm sure. Interestingly, the only place to ever say that is the Bible. No extra biblical literature from Persia, Assyria, Babylon. None of that says anything about the law being changed. It only comes from the Bible. The law of the Medes and Persians, very important. I mean, it was the law of the land. It dictated everything you did, and if it could not be changed, what it said goes. It wasn't up for debate. And so Ahasuerus brings his advisors in, which, by the way, this list of advisors that I can't pronounce, they're also mentioned in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 14. But he asks a question, a very serious question. According to the law, again, not talking about the law of Moses, we're talking about the law of the Medes and Persians. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? What are we going to do with her? Remember Daniel, when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego became the advisors? Their job was to read and learn the law. The king didn't know the law. He didn't care. Their job, the advisor's job, was to be able to tell you book, chapter, and verse what the law said. So, he's asking a very serious question. What are we going to do? Now, their answer, I think, is a little far-fetched. But again, I'm trying to remember these are real people in a real time who had real concerns. But they believe that this little act is going to cause a huge uprising in the kingdom. That's going to cause a revolt. Look at verse 16 and 17. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. Ooh. Because she didn't come into the presence of the king, regardless of whatever reason it was, because she didn't, there's going to be a revolt among all the women. Y'all, this is before TV and radio. This is before newspapers. I guess they're only relying on word of mouth to say that the queen did this. But my guess is these officials are drunk too. And they're worried about this. They thought it was going to be a national threat. And you have to remember, this is also before, well before the New Testament command of wives submit to your husbands and husbands love your wives. The marital relationship between a man and a woman at this time, very different than what we see now. Women were property. You tell them what to do and they do it. And for anything else to happen was a total disgrace, dishonor. So, there's the problem. The issue is they still haven't answered the king's question, have they? The king's question is, what am I supposed to do according to the law? They didn't answer it. They said, oh, king, it's going to get bad. It's going to get real bad, and here's why. But they never answered his question. Verse 18, I'm going to try to finish chapter 1 in the time that we have left. Verse 18, this very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed. There again, that it may not be repealed, only written in the Bible. That Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, For it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. Okay. There will be contempt and wrath and plenty. Right? This is a national threat. We've got to do something. If we don't do something, then the women are going to give a revolt and we're all going to be killed and this, that, and the other. I told you last week, I appreciate what movies and videos and TV shows like VeggieTales tries to do in teaching our young children biblical principles. I really do. I'm not going to stand up here like some people will and tell you that if you watch VeggieTales, you're going to hell. I'm not going to do that. But I will tell you, VeggieTales gets the story of Esther very wrong. I have heard it one of two ways, and then I actually read the text. What happened to Queen Vashti? Well, if you look at VeggieTales, she was banished. Other people will say that she died, that she was put to death. You don't see either of those in the text. All you see is that the title of queen is taken from her. It's very likely that Queen Vashti was still part of the king's harem, that she was still a wife of the king, because she would have been given to him as a merger of nations, more of a political marriage than an emotional marriage, certainly. So her title is stripped, and they say, we're going to give the title to someone who is better than her. Well, what's it going to take to be better than Queen Vashti? I mean, for crying out loud, that girl has slaved away in the kitchen all day making this feast for all these people. She has only refused the king one thing. Her name itself means beautiful woman. What in the world do you want? Well, we're going to find out, because Esther is going to be the one who takes her place. Verse 21 and 22, this advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So there's the law. They put it in. Law can't be changed. Now, the text leads us to believe that the law here is more about submission to your husband, more about the marital relationship of people who are in the nation of Persia and part of the Median Persian Empire. But what we need to know from this law, based on the implications it's going to have for the rest of the book, are twofold. Number one, Vashti is no longer queen, but she's still part of the harem. Number two, the king is looking for a new wife, and the king takes very seriously being disrespected by his wife. Now, you all know the story of Esther, and if you don't know the story, I guess I shouldn't assume that everyone knows the story. But if you do know the story, then you know that Esther is going to be charged with the task of coming to Ahasuerus and asking him to change a law. We should read that with this in the back of our minds. I don't think we understand just how dangerous it was for Esther to do what she did. And we'll talk about what she did later on when we get to chapter 3 and chapter 4. So there's chapter 1. What can we take away from chapter 1? King likes to drink. King has anger issues. The king acts before he thinks. And there's a position that needs to be filled. That's where we leave off. That's where we'll start back next week.